Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. We are going to dig into something that, on the surface, seems straightforward. But once you get into it, it opens up some really deep questions about how we understand and evaluate research. I'm going to talk about the distinction between description and interpretation and why getting this right is absolutely crucial when you're engaged in critical review. But before we dive into that, let me quickly touch on a related pair of concepts that often get mixed up with this one: fact versus reality. At the first glance, fact versus reality and description versus interpretation might seem like the same issue, but they actually differ in both emphasis and scope. So, what is fact versus reality really about? Well, its focus is ontological and philosophical. That is, it deals with the nature of truth in research. Let's say a research paper reports that 70% of participants agreed with the statement. That's a fact in the context of the data. But here is the catch. Does that fact reflect reality? Does it represent the broader population accurately? Or is it partial, constructed, or even distorted? That's the key issue. And so this foundation urges us as reviewers to ask, are the reported facts valid representations of the actual world? Now, here is where things get even more interesting. Description versus interpretation is often confused with fact versus reality, but it's not the same thing. This time, the focus is analytical and methodological. It's not about what is true, but about how meaning is made from observations. Let's take an example. Imagine you're working with qualitative data, say a transcript of an interview. That transcript, the actual words spoken, is your description, your raw data. But when you start identifying themes in those words or drawing conclusions about what they mean, that's interpretation. So the key question here becomes, are the interpretations drawn from the data justified? Let's summarize the difference to really appreciate the distinction between fact versus reality and description versus interpretation. We need to look at how each concept operates within research, and more importantly, within the practice of critical review. First, let's talk about fact versus reality. This distinction is rooted in ontology and philosophy. In other words, it concerns the nature of truth. When researchers present findings such as 70% of participants agreed with this statement, they are presenting what they consider a fact, a data point based on what was reported or measured. However, critical reviewers must ask, does this fact reflect reality? That is, does the reported percentage truly represent the broader truth of the population or phenomenon being studied? Or is it possibly a constructed, limited, or even misleading representation? The central concern here is whether what's being presented actually corresponds to the complexity of real world conditions. Now, contrast with that with description versus interpretation, which comes from an analytical and methodological perspective. Here we are less concerned with whether something is real in a philosophical sense, and more with how meaning is derived from the data that has been collected. For example, a participant might say in an interview, I just sat there. I didn't say anything. This is a description, a raw statement of what happened. But if the researcher then writes, the participant felt disempowered, they are offering an interpretation. The key question for critical reviewers is that interpretation justified by what was actually said? Is there evidence in the data to support such a conclusion? Or is the researcher reading too much into it? So, to put it simply, fact versus reality is about the truth status of what is presented. Are we looking at an accurate depiction of the world or a partial construction? Description versus interpretation is about how meaning is constructed from observations. Are we seeing the data itself or someone's analysis of what that data might mean? And here is a crucial takeaway. Both of these distinctions are essential in any critical review of research. One helps us evaluate the trustworthiness of what's being presented as truth, and the other helps us assess the legitimacy of the meanings being drawn from data. Overlooking either of them can lead to uncritical acceptance of flawed conclusions, or worse, the unchallenged spread of misrepresented knowledge. Now, let's go deeper into the description interpretation distinction with some real examples, because theory only gets us so far. Let's just start with a seemingly simple statement. The participant crossed their arms during the interview. You might think, okay, that's a description. And yes, it sounds like one. But what if I follow that up with this indicates the participant was feeling defensive or resistant? Now we have stepped over the line into interpretation. And the really tricky part, a lot of the time we interpret while thinking we are just describing. Here is one from education research. You are observing a classroom and you write, the teacher aggressively pointed at the student. Now stop and think. Is aggressively a neutral word? Nope. That's already colored with interpretation. You are not just saying what happened. You're saying what you think it meant. Now, how might you write this more descriptively? The teacher pointed out the student with the raised voice and narrowed eyes. That's raw material. Now your reader can decide, was that aggression, frustration, passion? See the difference? Now, let's say you are working with a participant's statement. I just sat there. I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to do. And you write in your analysis, the participant was paralyzed by fear. Well, maybe, but that's an interpretation. The participant didn't say, I was afraid. Instead, a more careful approach might be the participant described a moment of silence and inaction. This may suggest feelings of fear or uncertainty. That way, you're flagging the interpretive leap and showing where it begins. Why this matters in critical review? So, why does all this matter? Because you are reviewing research. One of the first and most important questions you need to ask is, where does the data stop and the interpretation begin? All research involves interpretation, even statistics. Interpreting numbers, making sense of patterns, that's all interpretation. What we need to know is, are the interpretations reasonable? Are they supported by the data? And most importantly, are they acknowledged as interpretations and not presented as if they are disputable facts? Now, let's take a survey example. A researcher writes, male students were less motivated than female students. Okay, what does that mean? Maybe they asked students to rate how much they enjoy attending class. What a 5-point scale. The male average was 3.1. The female average was 3.9. Sure, that's a numerical difference. But does that really mean the males are less motivated? Maybe they define motivation differently. Maybe they are more grade focused. Maybe they are less expressive in survey settings. So, your job as a critical reviewer is not to say this is wrong, but to ask, is this one possible interpretation of the data? Are there interpretations acknowledged? Is the conclusion cautious or is it overconfident? Here is a little trick. Whenever you read a claim in research. Ask yourself, could a reasonable person disagree with this interpretation, even if they accept the data? If the answer is yes, you're looking at an interpretation. Now, let's be honest. In real research, the line between description and interpretation gets blurry. And that's okay. It's not about being perfectly objective. That's impossible. What matters is transparency. If you are writing research, be clear when you are interpreting. Use phrases like this suggests, this may reflect. One possible explanation is. If you are reviewing, ask whether the author is overinterpreting. Ask whether alternative interpretations have been considered. Ask whether the interpretation is grounded in data or if it's drifting too far into assumption. Let me leave you with this. Interpretation is not the enemy of objectivity. It's the heart of analysis. The real problem isn't that researchers interpret. The problem is when interpretation pretends to be fact, when the line is blurred and never acknowledged. So, as readers, as reviewers, and as researchers, we have a responsibility to read carefully, to ask better questions, and to respect our readers' right to interpret alongside us. Thanks so much, and I'm happy to take your questions. See you next time.